Welcome to our October webinar, a collaborative presentation of the Federation for Children with Special Needs and the Recruitment, Training, and Support Center. My name is Mary Beth Landy, and I am the Training and Support Specialist for RTSC. Today's webinar topic is Tipping the Scales, how to integrate school and community resources can improve students' outcome and the Commonwealth's future, presented by Joan Gish. Joan is the Director of Strategic Initiatives, Center for Optimized Student Support at the Lynch School of Education, Boston College, where she is working with the statewide advisory board to develop an infrastructure to facilitate integration of education with social services, youth development, health, and mental health resources for the Massachusetts children and family. Today she will examine how trends in Massachusetts show that more children in more communities are experiencing circumstances including poverty, health, and mental health challenges that can interfere with the students' readiness to develop cognitive and social emotional skills demanded in school and in the workplace.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to be talking about how integrating school and community resources can improve student outcomes and the Commonwealth's future. This is me. I'm pleased to join you this afternoon and look forward to sharing with you some of the research we've gathered in our report called Tipping the Scales, which is attached for your review. Now, the idea of integrating comprehensive resources or wraparound for students is not new. It's been around for a very long time and at different times in history has gone under a series of names. Sometimes it's called wraparound, sometimes it goes under the umbrella of full-service schools, sometimes it's called comprehensive services, but all of these have to do with looking at children's more comprehensive non-academic needs and addressing them in some form. What is new today is that we have a confluence of both trends and knowledge that make this area particularly ripe for making a real difference in children's lives. One of the things we're seeing, as Mary Beth just alluded to, is that more children in more Massachusetts communities are experiencing intense barriers to learning. And we know from research, A, what these barriers are, the ways in which they can interfere with learning, and increasingly, the ways in which those barriers can be overcome. We're also learning from economists about the potential for well-integrated comprehensive resources to actually produce a return on investment at the level of society, let's say the state or a city. We are also seeing in the realm of both policy and practice that there are a lot of implementation models out there that allow us to study and learn about what is most effective and why. And we see in Massachusetts a fairly firm foundation, both in practice and increasingly in policy, that would make this an evolutionary next step in the Commonwealth's activity. Together, these things give us a set of knowledge, tools, and experiences to enable effective integrated student supports at scale. And I think as we talk today, this audience is going to be particularly attuned to some of the parallels that you might notice between both special education and general education comprehensive resource contexts. What I just ran through is going to give us an outline for our conversation today. We're going to be talking about the need in Massachusetts. I'll be sharing a lot of data, as well as what we're learning from research, what we're learning from practice, briefly cover the Massachusetts policy context, and talk about some next steps forward. I also want to point out that we have some new terminology in this space. Increasingly, there is a subset of activity called integrated student support. And this definition is provided by Child Trends, which is a major national research organization. And they did a report in 2014 on integrated student support. They have a new one coming out in November of 2017. And they define integrated student support in the following way: a school-based approach to promoting students' academic success by developing or securing and coordinating supports that target academic and non-academic barriers to achievement. That's the definition that we'll be working with today. So let's begin with our first section, and as we walk through this data, I'm interested to hear from you whether these data are consistent with your experience in schools. What are you seeing as you work with children across the Commonwealth? So between 2004 and 2014, Massachusetts quietly experienced a very significant change in the demographics and needs of the students coming into our schools. In that decade, we saw an increase of an additional 51,000 children living at or below the federal poverty line, about 39,000 additional children living in areas of concentrated poverty. We saw 76,000 more children in immigrant families than in 2004, and also another 31,000 students who are speaking a language other than English at home. In addition, we saw an increase of about 25,000 students who are living in single-parent homes, and we also saw a pretty steep rise in students dealing with homelessness, another 5,500 additional students experiencing homelessness than roughly 10 years ago. Now I'm using 2014 data here because in most cases that's the most recent data available. Now what we know that students in these circumstances in general are much more likely to experience barriers to learning, including uncorrected visual impairment, untreated dental caries, poorly managed asthma, obesity, adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, depression, behavioral challenges, or can be more likely to be diagnosed with a learning disability or ADHD. And we're seeing that these trends are not only concentrated in large urban centers. In fact, more and more high-needs children and families are moving into diverse communities across the Commonwealth. There was a research project by Sean Reardon that was published in the Globe, and this map shows you the changes over that same decade, how there are increasing concentrations of poverty in both small urban and suburban and rural communities than roughly 10 years ago. A quick snapshot looking at a diverse array of communities across the Commonwealth shows us that while there were upticks in almost every community, on a percentage basis, the upticks in large cities like Boston and Worcester was actually much smaller than the upticks that we saw in some of the smaller cities like Holyoke, Fitchburg, and Everett. And then we also see, on a percentage basis, fairly significant increases in communities like Burlington and South Hadley, which are both suburban and rural. Now, about 2 weeks ago, the Census Bureau updated their federal poverty data, and it includes an update for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and I want to show you something really interesting. Since 2014, the Commonwealth has seen a steep decline in the number of children who are living at or below 200% of the federal poverty level. And that makes sense because the economy has continued to improve, the labor market has tightened, and more families are earning wages that put them above this fairly minimal threshold. At the same time, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education in 2014 changed the way that they count students who are low income or this new category, economically disadvantaged. Now in general, economically disadvantaged is a much narrower category of students. In order to be counted in this category, students have to be eligible for SNAP, which is food stamps, TANF, which is welfare, or to be involved in the Department of Children and Families. Take a look at the data here. We continue to see in a wide array of Massachusetts communities significant increases between 2014 and 2016-17 in the number of children in the economically disadvantaged category. Now we know that in general, the number of students who are income eligible is declining. If you unpack the DCF caseload data, you see that a very significant proportion of these increases is driven by increases in the number of children engaged with the Department of Children and Families. In 2016, a report by the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education showed that 45% of all children in our schools are deemed high needs. What's also important to note is that while Massachusetts is generally considered the nation's top performing state when it comes to academic performance among its students, those very high averages mask important and persistent achievement gaps between low-income students and their peers. I won't walk through all of the data with you, but suffice it to say that progress has been minimal or non-existent when it comes to actually closing that difference in performance between low-income students and their higher-income peers. Whether you're looking at MCAS tests or looking at the National Assessment of Educational Progress, those patterns are fairly consistent. So what are we learning from the research? We've known for a long time that out-of-school factors can significantly influence in-school experiences and in-school academic performance. In fact, we've understood since the 1990s that roughly 2/3 of the variance in student achievement is predicted by out-of-school factors rather than in-school factors. And yet, we're also learning from the research that when high-need students receive comprehensive supports and opportunities, they can thrive academically, closing achievement gaps and reducing dropout rates. And our question is why? Some of the insight is coming from the neurobiological sciences, where scientists are essentially opening up a human brain to understand the differences in the structural brain development of children who are in healthy developmental circumstances and children who are not in healthy developmental circumstances. And in brief, we know that the experiences of both poverty and adversity can impact brain development principally in two ways. First, through a scarcity of developmentally stimulating and supportive resources. This might be a lack of books, a lack of exposure to rich vocabulary, a lack of access to enrichment opportunities, such as sports or arts, or even supportive relationships. Second, it can be impacted by stressors, both immediate and distant. That includes experiencing adversity or trauma, chaotic living conditions, parent mental health challenges, or unsafe neighborhoods. We also have significant insights about child development from the developmental sciences. And it's a broad body of literature, but it gives us some really important insights about how to support healthy child development. First is the understanding that every child is unique and has an individualized developmental trajectory and set of experiences. We know that child development occurs across domains: health, cognitive development, such as education and academic metrics, social and emotional development, are all key and intertwined with one another. So social emotional development can also impact cognitive or academic development, for example. We know that children experience strengths, such as protective factors, and also risks or negative factors that can either promote or inhibit healthy child development. We know that the intensity of those experiences matters. And we also know that development occurs simultaneously in different contexts. So a child's experience at home can be important, as can be the child's experience in school, in the community, in the neighborhood, and beyond. We also know that development occurs over time. It starts in utero and continues throughout our lifespan. There's a particularly sensitive period of development between the ages of 0 and 5, but the human brain continues to be shaped and is malleable through age 12 and even up through early and late adolescence through the 20s. We also know that intervention can change a child's developmental trajectory. One of the research projects housed where I work at the Boston College Lynch School of Education is a program called City Connects. City Connects began in the late 1990s by researchers at Boston College taking these insights from developmental science through a 2-year planning process with educators in the Boston Public Schools, local community agencies, and families, and basically going through a process to say, here's what we think might work for kids. How might we operationalize this in a way that would work in real schools and real communities? And they came up with a practice. In brief, The City Connects practice includes having an on-site coordinator, usually a full-time master's-trained social worker or school counselor. The school counselor is in the school, and every year in the fall, he or she will meet with every teacher to talk about every child every year. They talk about the child's strengths and needs across all domains of development. In this case, it's defined as cognitive, social, emotional, behavioral, physical health and well-being, and family. They talk about the child's strengths and needs in each of those domains, the intensity of need in those domains, and if there's a child who has particularly intensive or complex needs, they'll have an individual student review that will include many more adults, whether it's family members, a school psychologist, a school nurse, and in all cases, the goal is to come up with a proposed plan for that child that includes both in-school resources and community-based resources that we think will help optimize that child's chances for healthy development. So for every child, the plan is different, and for that child's plan might also change over time depending on the changing needs of that individual child's development, but also the changing circumstances that the child is experiencing over time. That plan is brought to families. Often it's tweaked. In all cases, families have to give their consent, and then the coordinator connects families with various community agencies, helps them to troubleshoot and problem solve, whether it's around filing paperwork or obtaining transportation, and there's ongoing feedback and follow-up with teachers and with families on an as-needed basis to make sure that services are being delivered and that the hoped-for changes are being seen in children. Today, City Connects, which began in Boston, is now in roughly 90 schools in 11 cities in 5 states, and it serves this year roughly 30,000 children. The primary mission of City Connects is to have children engage and learn in school by connecting each student with the tailored set of prevention, intervention, and enrichment services she or he needs to succeed and thrive. I wanted to point out, because I know a lot of folks here are working specifically with students who have IEPs, that we generally view integrated student supports as complementing what's in a child's IEP, and often it will go above and beyond. So while there might be a strong focus on what that student needs in terms of academic support, the integrated support approach will look at that child more comprehensively and say, you know, is there a talent? Is there an interest? There was a mom who came to a coordinator who had helped her find an arts program that's designed for children with autism, and the mom started bringing her son there on Saturdays, and a couple months later said that it was transformative. So that's the kind of thing that integrated student supports can do well beyond what an IEP will provide for, and certainly for children who both have special needs and are coming out of stressed economic circumstances, it can also include connecting the family to food resources, helping a family to cope with a homelessness situation, connecting the family to broader social services. It's really tailored to what that family needs. Also, the coordinator can play a sort of key coordinating role for children who are in DCF custody or engagement. And I visited a coordinator recently in one of the Boston elementary schools who was essentially working with roughly 15 different, therapists, agency contacts, multiple family contacts as this child was transitioning to a new family. It was really sort of serving as the locus of information and a point person in the school for everyone involved. So because City Connects was implemented a long time ago, and because it was implemented from within a university setting, looking at the impacts of City Connects was important from the beginning. But it's only in recent years that we've come to understand how significant these impacts are and what they might imply for supporting children more broadly with an approach to integrated student support. So here's what we've learned from City Connects. Students who were enrolled in City Connects elementary schools in Boston, this was a cohort of approximately 7,900 students across the city, received City Connects support during elementary school. In this case, the program ended after the 5th grade, but they were able to follow students beyond City Connects, beyond elementary school, into middle school. And look what happened when they took the 8th grade MCAS. Students who received that support closed approximately 2/3 of the achievement gap relative to the state average on math. They closed roughly half of the achievement gap on English. There was a separate analysis done looking at the impact of City Connects on immigrant and English language learner students. They too saw significant gains, in this case on the English language arts MCAS, of approximately half of the achievement gap being narrowed. That same group of students was then followed into high school, and researchers took a look at their 4-year high school dropout rate. Students who received City Connects comprehensive student supports during elementary school were roughly half as likely to drop out during high school. A more recent analysis was interested to know whether or not those effects would hold for some of our groups at highest risk of dropping out during high school, including Black and Latino males, and found that in fact those groups of kids did as good, if not better, when it came to reducing dropout because they had received comprehensive supports early on. There has also been an analysis to look at whether or not City Connects had an impact on absenteeism, and this chart shows a reduction in chronic absenteeism. So students who would be absent from school 10% of days or more was significantly reduced over the long term for students who had received comprehensive support during elementary school. Now, I have a video. I'm going to attempt to play it for you. Bear with me. I have a couple of things to click here, and hopefully we'll get it playing for you in just a moment.
If you think of a child's life as a teeter-totter, for some children, many risk factors and negative experiences can pile up on one side, and it tilts them down and makes it very difficult for them to do well in life. And we have to think about, what do we need to do to counterbalance any of those negative experiences that happen or may happen in the future? We want to have a lot of positive experiences and weights of various kinds on the positive side in order to tilt that child's life back in a positive direction.
So you may even have a lot of negative factors, but if you have a lot of protective factors, then the teeter-totter will stay balanced or hopefully be weighted more in the positive direction, and good outcomes will happen.
Perhaps the most important protective or positive factor is the presence of a stable, positive adult in the child's life. A parent, mentor, church member, or even a concerned neighbor can tilt the teeter-totter of a stressed, vulnerable child in a positive direction. While some adults may be contributing to the child's stress, even these relationships can be repaired, and that adult can become a weight on the positive side. It is also possible for children who have been moved into foster care to build a positive environment in which to strengthen their resilience.
So the other component of a teeter-totter is the place where it's balancing, that fulcrum. For most of us, we probably start out life pretty much in the middle, with a balanced kind of teeter-totter, and things get added to weight it.
I hope that played well for all of you. So essentially, when researchers look at these long-term positive impacts that we see from intervening early on, one of the sort of theoretical explanations for what's happening is this idea of resilience that was described in the video. We think that the process that City Connects involves essentially means taking a look at this developmental scale for every child, understanding what is on the negative side of the scale and what is on the positive side of the scale, and then working hard to minimize the negative factors. Maybe that's by connecting a family to food resources or social services or housing resources or to a more positive set of relationships. At the same time, there's effort to bolster the positive side, to cultivate a child's talent or interest, to give them a chance to develop more positive peer relationships, let's say through an after-school opportunity. This process seems to be, over time, tilting the scale. And so what we think is the key to doing this work well is driving the right resources to the right child at the right time over time. I want to pause here to see if there are any questions. These were children who received City Connects during their entire elementary school career, so that was roughly 6 years. However, researchers are finding that there are positive impacts that occur after roughly 3 years of intervention. Now, these data are based on the elementary school intervention. City Connects has in fact been adapted for settings going from the pre-K setting all the way up through an experiment currently at a community college. We don't have as much outcomes data from those interventions, but we are continuing to investigate and to see whether or not intervention at different times during the developmental continuum is an important consideration, but also that dosage question. How long do you have to do this before you start to see long-term impacts? And based on what we know right now, the answer to that is roughly 3 years.
Okay.
So the coordinator really takes on responsibility for facilitating those connections. And they're really doing it in a very individualized and tailored way, not only for the child, but also for the family. Some families, it can be a phone call. For other families, it's sitting down with them and helping them to complete the paperwork. It's putting in calls to the program and facilitating that connection. It might be helping the family to problem solve around transportation. It might be choosing a new after-school program because it allows for late pickup because mom is working a later shift, serves dinner, and has a math tutoring support that the child would benefit from. So they're really taking a lot of different things into consideration. Really it's the coordinators who are dedicated to making sure that not only are they, they're not just handing someone a piece of paper and saying, you go figure it out. They're really facilitating those connections in a myriad of ways in order to support the family and support the child. This particular approach is based in a school, and they're doing this for every child in the school.
Okay.
However, there are a lot of communities that are really thinking about how to better connect families more generally to resources. So just off the top of my head, I know that this is something Boston is working on, and they've developed like a community partner database. Somerville has something called the Somerville Hub, which is also like an online portal that has information organized by age group and sort of subject matter to help facilitate families getting connected to a broader array of resources to support both them and their children. This is something Cambridge is working on as well. We're starting to see a real proliferation of effort for a variety of reasons, but part of it is this rising tide of need that people are seeing at the city level and certainly within the schools.
Mm-hmm.
So walking through this, it seems like there are a number of parallels between integrated support and some of the lessons learned from special education. And some of the things that occur to me is that this work is not only about access, but it's really about impacting healthy child development in order to set the stage for learning. The idea that there are rarely silver bullets, that it's usually about connecting a child to the right set or complex of resources that they need in order to be successful. And the idea that there are a lot of efforts out there that are focused on integrating resources by getting all the data systems to work at the level of the city or by bringing resources to the school, and those can be important. But part of what we see here is that in order to drive outcomes, integration at the level of the child really seems to be key. We also see that as in special education, schools are uniquely well situated to do this work. An additional set of research that was done that has really interesting implications for this work. There was a team of researchers from Columbia University at their Center for Benefit Cost Studies in Education, and they did 2 different analyses of City Connects. The first is on the right, and they basically said, do the benefits of City Connects outweigh the costs? If on the cost side of the ledger, we include the cost of the coordinator, the cost of supporting that coordinator with professional development and some technology and some training, do the benefits outweigh the costs? And their initial answer was yes. by approximately $11 for every $1 initially invested. But then they asked the much more important question, and that was, do the benefits outweigh the cost if we include not only the cost of the coordinator and the cost of supporting that coordinator, but also the cost of all the dollars that we invest in services like healthcare, after-school programs, social services, and the like. And it turns out that at the society level, for every dollar, public or private, that we invest in those services that are then coordinated through the City Connects coordinator, we saw a return on investment, conservatively, of $3 for every $1 invested. Essentially what they're doing is they're taking the resource landscape that exists around all of our schools and in all of our communities, this sort of complex, chaotic mix of agencies and services and programs, and they transform it into a system that is organized and capable of driving the right resources to the right child at the right time over time. In Boston, I'll give you a snapshot of what that looked like. Last year, in Boston, City Connect served 11,311 students. They connected those students to 92,799 services from roughly 380 community partners. And on the right, there's a map of those community partners, color-coded by the type of institution that they are. And that gives you a picture of what's possible. If we apply that at the state level, a back-of-the-envelope calculation is that out of the total state budget, we spend roughly $7.7 billion on services to children and families. If we could triple the benefits of those dollars, we can make an enormous dent and really transform what's possible for kids across the state. So not only are we learning from the sciences, importantly, we're also learning from people who are doing the real work on the ground. And it's not only City Connects that's doing this work. There are myriad organizations across the country that are in some way engaged in integrating comprehensive services for children, usually in schools and sometimes from a community context. There was a national research review that I referenced earlier in our conversation today, done by Child Trends in 2014, and they are updating this report in November of 2017. They essentially looked at the evidence emerging from approaches to integrated student support, and they find that there is emerging evidence that integrated student supports can contribute to student academic progress as measured by decreases in grade retention and dropout, and increases in attendance, math achievement, reading and English language arts achievement, and overall GPA. Just a quick preview, their new report is basically going to say that the evidence base continues to mount and that the evidence is increasingly promising and closely wedded to the developmental science, and they think that it's an area that has great promise. So part of what we are grappling with is how can we make effective integrated student support possible at scale? In Massachusetts, we already have a fairly robust foundation in both policy and practice. A succeeding series of pieces of legislation. There are commissions that are dedicated to looking more comprehensively at the needs of the whole child. There is a new federal policy context through ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, which allows for some latitude to use resources in support of comprehensive services for students. And we also see the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education in Massachusetts prioritizing support for the social, emotional, and health needs of students and families, and investing in things like systems for student success. At the same time, there are a wide array of practices taking place in schools already that, with fairly minor adjustments, really speak to doing integrated student supports effectively. And there's a list of things that are commonly underway in schools already. We've increasingly been engaged with the Safe and Supportive Schools Commission, and it includes, so the Safe and Supportive Schools Commission is there to support safe, positive, healthy, and inclusive whole school learning environments. And among the things that this broad group of stakeholders brought together in a statewide commission is working on is both a framework for schools and districts and a self-assessment tool for them to use. Now, under new budget language, we are working with the Safe and Supportive Schools Commission to build this integrated student support principles of effective practice into both the framework and the self-assessment tool. And that's something that districts are using across the Commonwealth and are supported by grants to do so. Also, from the ground up, we're seeing a real recognition of the need for this kind of work. There was a report done in 2014 by Mass Inc. It has a long title, Building Community-Wide Social and Emotional Support Systems in Massachusetts Gateway Cities, Assessing Progress from the Perspective of Local Educators. But as they unpacked what was happening relative to student support in schools in the gateway cities, one of the core recommendations from gateway city leaders was to create a backbone infrastructure for systemic solutions in order to help link and coordinate school and community-based resources. I spoke to a superintendent and I said, "What did you mean by that?" And he said, "We'd like to not have to reinvent the wheel." And so that is what we are beginning to help make possible. We have brought together a phenomenal advisory board made up of a broad group of stakeholders to develop a statewide infrastructure here in Massachusetts to facilitate the local integration of education with social services, youth development, health and mental health resources for children and families. We are working with the advisory board both to leverage their expertise and to begin to share more and more of this information. We are working with a variety of partners to begin to create this infrastructure so that it would be adaptable to different age groups as well as different geographies across the state. And the hope is that if we can figure out how to do this well in Massachusetts, we can then leverage this work into new states. And we're seeing a series of inquiries from more and more states across the country. And we hope that Massachusetts can be in a real leadership role. There are a number of bridges to policy and practice that are already under construction. One is principles of effective practice, and I think that we can distribute a brief with those principles to you. We're also beginning to draft standards to guide this work that are rooted in the research and based on the evidence relative to student outcomes. We're beginning to build things like self-assessment tools for schools and districts, as well as to build up professional development opportunities. Beginning to think about how to organize professional learning communities, and also to develop a growing set of both tools and resources to enable this work at scale. We are seeing a number of different ways in which schools and districts can be supported to do this kind of work. One is through a Safe and Supportive Schools Commission grant, a Systems for Student Success grant. Previously, there were wraparound zone grants, and there are partnerships. There was actually, just yesterday, an announcement by Chan Zuckerberg Initiative and the Ford Foundation that there are communities across the country eligible for planning grants of roughly $150,000 to support sort of systems that put students at the center and integrate comprehensive resources. So there are 4 Massachusetts communities that are eligible under their criteria, as well as a series of partnerships that are out there to enable this work. And we're going to continue to work with our advisory board to advance it. Just to kind of give you a flavor for some of what we're starting to articulate, here are the sort of 4 C's, the principles of effective practice. I won't go into them in great detail, but the rough ideas that we covered, that to do this work well, it should be customized, coordinated, comprehensive, and continuous, where for the first time we can actually leverage insights from the developmental sciences, evidence of what is working to support student learning and thriving, and the experience of programs and educators to develop that backbone infrastructure that would enable effective practices and allow for local adaptation to a community's specific needs and contexts. And so that is the work that we are beginning to undertake. Please be patient with us because it is a lot, but at the same time, it is very clear that this is possible, that there's great interest, and we appreciate the opportunity to share what we're learning and what we're excited to work on with all of you, and welcome any questions that you may have. We
do not have any further questions. though I think it would be great if you could talk a little bit more about the infrastructure that you were speaking of. If you could expand on that a little bit.
Yeah.
Of what you really mean by that infrastructure at this juncture and also moving forward.
Terrific, thank you. So with the guidance of the advisory board, we really have defined 3 core areas of work to define this infrastructure. One is around setting the policy context to support this type of work. 2 is around communications, continuing to knowledge share. Thank you for this opportunity. Continuing to get stories in newspapers, to publish op-eds, to put out reports like Tipping the Scales, which led to a legislative briefing and an opportunity to share some of this research and this work with policymakers. We're starting to both co-sponsor and also host conferences, also again to share this information. So a tremendous amount of work relative to communications. And then the third area is really around support for implementation. And that's where things like professional development, resources, one of the things we're working on is a compendium that just delineates the landscape of approaches to integrating comprehensive supports for children. There's nothing like that out there. There's a tremendous amount of work going on across the country and even across the globe. So let's get our arms around that and start to essentially identify the toolbox that practitioners have to do this work, and then help to arbitrate that by really understanding from the sciences what we think is likely to be most effective and why, and to help point practitioners to things that we think can be useful to them as they think about this work. So really building up the resources and tools to support effective implementation at scale is the third area of work that we mean when we talk about developing an infrastructure.
Great.
That's a great question, and probably something that we should work to develop. What I can tell you is that we have a list of districts that are already engaging by using City Connects, a list of districts that were involved in the state's wraparound zone initiative, a list of districts who are doing something in terms of sort of a more comprehensive look at student support through something like the Safe and Supportive Schools grant. There is a group of districts that are coming together under Systems for Student Success, which is a project facilitated at the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. So there is a fair amount of momentum on the ground. I actually have not put all of those communities together in a list, but I'll take that as a really good suggestion. Thank you. So I was talking really about the City Connects model, and one of the things that actually was intriguing to me and what brought me to Boston College was the fact that the City Connects model is one that has not only been adapted successfully across children's age ranges and across roughly 90 different school settings, but also it's operated successfully in public, private, and charter schools. The one thing they all have in common is that they're serving very high need student populations. On average, about 91% of children served by City Connects are low income, roughly 19% are learning English, and roughly 20% are on an IEP. And so it is possible to do this work in a private school setting, but I don't know whether or not the writer's particular school is involved with City Connects or another either organization or set of supports to enable implementation.
Okay, thank you.